It does give me great pleasure this morning to introduce our keynote speaker for this conference. And I'd like to welcome Penny Sparke, who is delivering our inaugural Ron Toranak lecture, named for our patron, Ron Toranak. For those of you who don't know Penny's work, she is Professor of Design History at Kingston University in London and Director of the Modern Interiors Research Centre. She studied French literature at Sussex University and completed her PhD in Design History in 1975, and she's taught in various institutions at what is now Brighton University, the Royal College of Art, and now, of course, at Kingston. And Penny Sparke is an internationally acclaimed authority on modern design history and a very influential figure in this field. And in her position, she's given a lot of keynote addresses and broadcasts. She's published very widely, and she's curated also a number of exhibitions, including The Plastics Age at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London in 1990. And in 2007, she worked as a consultant for Pyrex, helping with the communication project for their new cookware range designed by George Soden. I think that's really interesting, a design historian moving across into industry and consulting there. We can do these things. And her publication record, just the books, is, I have to say, rather daunting. She's published 15 books on design history, some of which have gone into multiple editions because they've become standard text in the field. And as the reviewer of her study of interior designer, Elsie de Wolfe, noted in the review, Penny Sparke's work has, quote, defined as well as reflected the changing preoccupations of design history. And I think that's really important. She has set out a lot of the framework in which we discuss design history today. And her publications include introductory texts, such as An Introduction to Design and Culture, and this has gone through 3 major editions and rewrites over its 20 or 30 year history, and Design in Context in 1987, and the Design Source Book of 1986. Then, on the other hand, there are studies of materials and typologies like The Plastics Age and The Century of Car Design, which came out in 2002. There are national surveys such as Japanese Design of 1987 and Italian Design of 1988. And there are also designer-focused works such as Ettore Sottsass Jr. in 1982. But during the 1990s, Penny Sparke shifted her attention to broader cultural issues related to design, particularly around gender. And she published As Long as It's Pink, The Sexual Politics of Taste in 1995. And this period also saw her extended work on modern interior design, and this included a study of the famous interior designer Elsie de Wolfe, and also her publication of The Modern Interior in 2008. And she's still working in this field, but has introduced plants and natural forms into the modern interior, which is where her research is heading now. I've known Penny for some time now. In fact, I was really amazed looking at her publication record and seeing the Elsie de Wolfe publication is over 10 years old, because I recall being at Kingston and in your office, and the book had either just come from the printers or was about just to go to the printers. So that's over 10 years. So we've known each other for quite a long time and catch up when we're in each other's towns. And I've always admired her broad reach across design history, the very long view from the 19th century to the present, the ability to transition between broad surveys, themed studies, and also detailed biographical study. And that's a real art, to be able to do the broad macro survey and also the very detailed studies. And her work is particularly inspiring to me. As I've said before, Australian design history is relatively underdeveloped as an academic discipline, and its parameters are relatively confined in both typology and chronology. And certainly in the context of Australian design, automotive design history is a very recent proposition. And Penny's groundbreaking book, A Century of Car Design, was an enormous inspiration for me. when I was putting together the exhibition Shifting Gear, because it gave me the courage to go ahead to do this fairly mad exhibition, but also gave me the framework for thinking about car design and the sort of categories in which you could talk about it, and the way you could carve up a century and think about cars in that way. And so with all of that, it's a great pleasure that I welcome Penny to deliver the keynote address.
Thank you, Harriet. That was a lovely summary of my career. I've never heard quite so clearly before. Even this would make sense. You just do what you do. But thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to be here. I was here yesterday and thoroughly enjoyed all the papers. Like you, I learned a lot. It was really full of information and ideas. I thought it was fascinating. Okay, so I'm going to attack the subject of design versus styling in automotive history, I suppose, which is a thorny one, as I'm sure you all know, because these words are very heavily loaded. But I wanted to try and just open the discussion. I haven't got any answers particularly, but I want to at least have a discussion following my talk. So as Harriet said, I published a book a while back called A Century of Car Design. I should say I'm not a car expert. It was just something I felt needed doing, so I did it. My aim in writing that text was to fill a gap in the story of modern design, and to show that although car design had been largely sidelined by mainstream design history, I believe, I think the same aesthetic, functional, technological, social, and cultural considerations that go into the design of a chair, and I'm showing you a sort of iconic modern chair there, the Candizi chair in the Bauhaus. Those considerations that design historians have dealt with furniture are also very important, obviously, in cars, but somehow it hasn't been done in quite the same way. So that was my reason for doing it. Now, my aim in this talk is to address the complex and changing definitions of design and styling that relate to the history of the automobile, and so I'm covering a broad field, and to demonstrate that that story exists within design history. You can't separate it out, I don't think. It needs to be in there. Now, a fundamental issue in any discussion about car design, if we're using that term, is the fact that the word styling was so widely used through the 20th century, and continues to be, to describe what I would call the car designer's practice. So I'm interested in the actual practice of styling or designing. I think this is a linguistic issue, but it's proved hugely problematic because it's created a hierarchy and has tended to marginalise the work of car designers from that of their peers in other fields such as product, architecture, interior design, furniture. We tend to, in the academy to sort of separate it out because car styling is one thing, whereas design is about those other things. I think an assumption has been made that the car stylist works in a more commercial and possibly superficial way, and I say that, carefully. I don't think superficial in the least. There's a sense in which all they do is put nice bodies on, whereas designers of chairs go deeper, if you like. And I think, and I'm going to come back to this in this talk, that this assumption derives from the cultural dominance through the 20th century of the modernist design values developed at the Bauhaus in Germany in the 1920s. I'm assuming most of you will have heard of the Bauhaus. It's probably the most famous design school of the 20th century. And again, the product on the right came out of it. Marcel Breuer designed it, was a student and teacher there. And it was a sort of, if I use the term form follows function, fitness for purpose, you know what I mean by that basic design philosophy. So in this talk, by aligning examples of car design with other areas of design, I hope to show that it has a rich history worthy of the same kind of discussion that has been given to other fields. That's my aim. Okay, I'm going to start with the Model T Ford, and I think all histories of modern histories, many of them start with that. I think it provides a baseline for a discussion about car design. Ford's famous comment that the car could be produced in any colour so long as it's black, as we all know, demonstrates that the object was not aesthetically focused, and was therefore not, I would suggest, a styling exercise. What then did design mean in this context? In essence, the Model T came at the end of a period dominated by invention and technological innovation. That was the zeitgeist, if you like. This wasn't about art, if you like. The problem Ford had wanted to solve was how to create an automobile that could be made at a price that was affordable to the large numbers of rural Americans who, until that moment, had had to make do with a horse. It was that simple. It was a horseless carriage, then, that allowed these early consumers to bring their products into town. Aesthetics wasn't an issue, but I think status symbolism probably was, and I think that requirement was provided by ownership alone, because this was the first car most people bought, so simply purchasing a Model T made you somebody. It didn't matter so much what it looked like. The car didn't need to be bigger and better than that of one's neighbour. It simply had to do its job at an affordable price. It was enough that it existed. So this was kind of what I would call a tabula rasa approach to design, and ironically one that would be supported by the Bauhaus. It is form follows function, if you like. What was needed was technological acumen and basic marketing know-how. That's what brought this car into being. There was no need for art at this point. If we look for a parallel in other design fields of the period, we find it in early electrical appliances, which were also the result of technological inventiveness and market demand. I'm just giving you two sort of random examples. But again, these aren't art objects, they're technology objects that were needed by the mass market. There were, interestingly, exceptions to the rule in this area. Some appliances were destined for the feminine or domestic sphere, therefore had to be embellished with decoration. I'm just giving you two quick examples. The sewing machine on the right, obviously a woman's object in the living room, so it's got this lovely scroll work. And on the left, a toaster that would have been used on the family dining table has this little kind of French decoration on it. So it's interesting where art came in and where art didn't come in. But of course, with cars, the Model T didn't need that decoration. It was a public sphere object, not a domestic object. It could simply be a basic machine, a functional artifact with no aesthetic purpose. What's more, once it had been perfected technologically, it could, theoretically at least, remain unchanged. In other words, it was, so long as it's black, it was just the car. As long, that is, as people were willing to buy it, and that was where the crunch came. Now, the first key change that occurred in the story of car design in the first decades of the 20th century related less to visual innovation for its own sake than to new patterns of car consumption, and I'll explain what I mean by that. There was a huge difference between rural farmers buying their first car and new city dwellers wanting to change their car, and in so doing, expressing their upward social mobility. So when Americans came to the city, they still wanted a new car, they wanted a second car. Now, conscious of those changes, Alfred P. Sloan at General Motors, and we heard a bit about this yesterday, he developed an approach towards car manufacturing, car design, that was more consumer-related and style-conscious. As well as focusing on consumer requirements from a visual perspective, and here's just a couple of early GM cars, and you can see these are stylish, if you like. It's an art element. So as well as focusing on consumer requirements from a visual perspective, he also developed a new manufacturing approach that moved Ford's philosophy of mass production and product standardization forwards. And as we know, Ford went into crisis in the late 20s because of what GM was doing. He developed the idea of flexible mass production. In essence, this brought with it product diversity and annual model changes, and of course style is an important element of those. He also, interestingly, introduced the idea of installment purchasing, which meant that his customers didn't have to wait to buy the car of their dreams, they could get them instantly. So this idea of quick shifting purchasing was important. Now what Sloan really did was to inject the idea of fashion into the world of automobiles, and that's what hadn't been there with Ford. This was not a fashion object, but by the time you get to GM, it is. Now this meant that colour and style, as well as technological inventiveness and engineering sophistication, suddenly became a requirement of consumers. Sloan had to find a means of injecting aesthetic values into his cars, and the well-known story of his employment of Harley Earl, an ex-set designer, interestingly, not a car person at all. And I think the story is hugely relevant. And again, it's well known, but it's worth thinking about it again in this context. So in 1927, Earl created the art and colour section of General Motors. He transformed the automobile from an engineered object into a stylish consumer artefact. Rather than appealing to the consumer's minds by offering reliability and efficiency, interestingly we had a lot about that yesterday in those early cars, they were the criteria, maybe speed as well, but certainly those kind of rational qualities. He appealed to consumers' hearts by offering stylishness, theatricality, fashion, glamour, luxury and comfort. And he just demonstrated that in his LaSalle, very famous LaSalle model, image of him with his drawing board and the car. And you can see what's happened if you try to simply compare it with Ford. It's a completely different animal we're talking about. Interestingly, what Earl introduced into the automotive industry quickly spread into other design areas. Office equipment, cameras, furniture and interior design soon succumbed to the body contours of streamlining. And again, this story of the industrial designers of the 1920s and 30s in the States, Lowe's famous Gestetner, and just an example, Teague's little camera, the kind of streamlined forms, the chrome strips, the things that Earl introduced into his cars, suddenly move into static objects. So, the idea of speed is what's denoted by this, but these are obviously static objects, so it's obviously an aesthetic decision. Okay, the same logic was in place, and this is an American context I'm talking about. In order to beat competitors in an economically challenged era, 1920s in America, products had to have added value. As a result, objects sold on their looks rather than their efficiency or even their price. They had to be objects of desire. So in automotive history, the era of styling had begun, and this is when the word comes in. Now, over the next century, various different models of car styling emerged, each of which can seem to have parallels in a wider design context. That's what I'm going to take you through quickly. I'm going to take you through a few examples. First of all, I'm starting with Art Deco. So one of these models brought luxury and glamour together with craftsmanship. In 1930s Europe, what came to be called Art Deco made an impact across the fine and decorative arts. And I think, again, this is well known. But it also influenced the upmarket design of the automotive coach builders and companies such as Hispano-Suiza, Van den Plas, Figioni and Falaschi, Delahaye, Chaperon, Castagna, others, many of the upmarket European producers who were producing highly crafted, high-quality cars with sumptuous interiors aimed at the wealthy. And I think the best parallel to this phenomenon was haute couture, fashion. These were fashionable objects aimed at a particular clientele. So high-quality, visually innovative, glamorous clothing produced by the firms of Schiaparelli, Chanel, and others were aimed at an elite clientele. In design history terms, both Art Deco furniture and decorative arts and haute couture dress have been the subject of extensive scholarship, so we know a lot about these things. As yet, luxury cars have yet to be studied in the same way, I would argue. They have been studied, of course, but very much as marks, brands, as sort of particular things in this very specific ways. They haven't been added to the broader history. In many ways, these objects can be seen as yet more fashion accessories, much like the decorative handbags and jewellery that have found themselves in design history literature. So I'm arguing the cars fit into this same zeitgeist. Also, the relatively new academic discipline, the history of the interior, which I'm very much part of, could do well to address the interiors of these luxury cars, which are just as interesting as any other interiors. So I'm arguing that they fit into a moment in design history, but as yet that's still to be done. Another important model of car styling can easily be seen as part of an important modern design phenomenon, and that's Italian design. I'm going to talk a little bit about post-war Italian design, which again we heard about yesterday, very interestingly. The cars that emerged from the Italian coach builders in the years following World War II played an important role within the general desire to create a new aesthetic language on Italian soil up from 1945. Lots of reasons for this, sort of the nationalistic reasons. There were a huge number of sort of drivers for the Italian design phenomenon. Now, the documentation of that phenomenon has emphasized the importance, once again, furniture and even office machinery. And the names of designers and firms that contributed it have been widely celebrated. Olivetti and Zanusso's work is very well known. I'll throw up a few of the names of the furniture designers and the architects. People like Castiglione, Zanusso, Molino, Magistretti, I won't go on, there's lots of them, are almost household names within design history. The heroes of a design movement that challenged the hegemony of fine art. This was almost saying that design can be fine art. This is really what was going on. Now, this is not to say that the coach builders of the same era and the iconic cars that were produced have not been equally fated. Of course they have. But I think what has happened is that they've again been seen in isolation, celebrated primarily by collectors, connoisseurs, and entered into museums, but they haven't quite hit design history. Only the famous inclusion of the Cisitalia in New York's Museum of Modern Art on the left perhaps has bucked that trend. But the fact that it doesn't contain an engine, that car's just a shell, suggests that it's being celebrated as a piece of sculpture rather than a piece of remarkable car design in which art, craft, and engineering came together. So it's interesting how when art historians and design historians choose to put a car in a museum, it doesn't have an engine in it, which is absurd. Now, and I'm just putting an interior on the right because there's lots and lots of discussion about Italian interiors, but I think there's an intellectual distance between the appreciation of the Italian domestic interior of the 50s and 60s and these objects of the public sphere, such as the cars, which are just simplified as sculpture. Perhaps the Vespa motor scooter has crossed that divide, and when we do talk about the Vespa in books about Italian design, but again, I think it's usually considered as a sculpted body shell rather than an object of transport. So again, it's considered only in a certain way. And again, the little Fiats, the Seicento and the Cinquecento, have also been absorbed into a number of design history accounts, once again as mass-produced sculptural objects. And I think they're talked about in the same breath as sewing machines and typewriters. So some of them have been pulled in, I think because they look like these objects. There's a kind of family resemblance, and that's why they've been pulled in. But they haven't really been discussed, I would suggest, as cars fitting in a much more complex way with design history. Now, interestingly, the Italian cars of the era, the Ferraris, which we heard about, the Maseratis, the Lamborghinis, created by men such as Bertoni, Michelotti, Spada, Frua, and others, you know all about them. Now, these are still considered to be styled rather than designed. If you read about them, it is still a styling exercise we're talking about, and that's what keeps them separate, I would suggest. However, there's a kind of sense now that the close alliance with contemporary sculpture that's talked about so often in this context makes styling more acceptable. So this isn't sort of crass commercial styling. It's much more art styling. So the idea of styling shifts a little bit, but it still isn't design. Okay, so this is perhaps the acceptable face of car styling, and the moment at which it nearly touches what was described in the period as good design, and this was a word used very widely, but not used for cars. For the most part then, cars have been seen either as feats of engineering or the results of styling rather than design. And as I've said, the latter focuses on the decorative and the applied arts. And as mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, it's largely because of the role played by principles developed at the Bauhaus, which considered architecture to sit at the peak of the design hierarchy. Now, having said that, there have been some occasions when car design has aligned itself either with modern architecture or with functionist principles. You probably know these examples on the left. Walter Gropius, the director of the Bauhaus, tried his hand at car design with his Adler, and Le Corbusier very famously designed a car. So, and as we're going to hear later about Robin Boyd, there is that link between architecture and cars. However, I would suggest that these two were not particularly successful experiments. Gropius's Adler car was rather conservative as a car. It wasn't innovative at all. What it was trying to do was be architecture on wheels, which isn't a car. And Corp's design wasn't realised en masse, although it's quite predictive, as we know. But again, it was a sort of a quirky one-off thing. Now, good, standardized, simple, modern design for everyone, which is the Bauhaus creed, which incidentally is what Ford was actually advocating. So Ford is your Bauhaus designer, if you like. But it does begin to have some successes into the post-war period. And arguably, the European people's car, whether it be the Beetle or the 2CV, have kind of got through the good design filter because they're sort of little icons and they're kind of, they're mobile sewing machines, if you like, rather than cars, if you know what I mean. There's a spectrum. They're sitting at that end of it. So they kind of get into the design definition. And I think in the post-war years, these cars can be seen as existing alongside, say, the German highly minimalist, neo-modernist product designs of Dieter Rams and the revived Bauhaus designs of that era. So they kind of fit within that moment. And I think one could even extend that statement to classic designs, things like the E-Type Jaguar and the Porsche 911. And again, the appreciation of them is near to that kind of Bauhaus definition. So they kind of come out of the car story and enter the good design story, or they cross those two stories. Okay, now I'm going to go to the other end of the spectrum completely and talk about the 1950s American dream car, which is something completely other. It had its roots obviously less in architecture than in the world of fantasy, popular taste, and conspicuous consumption. And the design parallel here was with the 1950s dream home, the site of feminine aspiration and desire. There's just two examples of 50s dream home. Now, the concept of styling established by Earl and others in the interwar years was, as I've said, a reaction to Ford's early idea that the automobile was an engineered functional machine that simply appealed on the basis of efficiency and reliability. It was a means through which the industry could reach consumers and persuade them to change their cars on a regular basis. So if cars sit somewhere along the engineering fashion spectrum, aligning themselves with other aspects of consumer culture and by the time you get to the 50s and targeting different levels of the market. So in the 40s and 50s, automobiles suddenly rushed to the fashion end of the spectrum and picking up what Earl was doing later. They could, of course, not ignore technology. Let's have a couple of cars up while we're talking. They couldn't ignore technology, but they concealed it very effectively under their Baroque body shells. Now, it's at this moment that styling becomes a dirty word. It isn't really a dirty word before then, it's just what goes on. And the reason is it's associated by critics with conspicuous consumption and waste. Books by the American author Vance Packard, like The Wastemakers and others, which I'm sure you know about, made this very clear. Not only were these cars wasteful, their critics maintained, they were also excessively decorative. The automobile industry was unapologetic, of course, and continued to produce dream cars into the 60s. Now, supporters of the energy and imagination of popular culture, though, have described this phenomenon differently, seeing 50s dream cars as a moment at which car symbolism was at its most sophisticated and imagination at its most unfettered. So you get different views. There's the kind of the waste one, and then there's the sort of, these were wonderful dreams, icons of an era. So it's a complex world. Now, the dream car phenomenon was in part the result of the intense competition that existed between the three giant American manufacturers of the day, GM, Chrysler, and Ford. And with the help of stylists, there's just two of them, people like Earl, still going, Virgil Exner, Gregory, and others, they added bigger and bigger body adornments, chrome, fins, radiator grills, rear lights, inspired by jet and rocket imagery, and technical novelties, as you know. Interiors featured beauty accessories, drinks cabinets, and cigarette lighters in an effort to replicate the living room. Earl famously said that getting into one of his cars was like going on vacation. So it's a very experiential approach towards car styling. And above all, it was a very utopian vision, I would suggest. So automobiles of this era were the ultimate symbol of conspicuous consumption. while refrigerators and food mixers also managed to capture the desire on the part of new affluent consumers to express their joy in attaining the lifestyle they'd long aspired to, automobiles took that pleasure into the public sphere for all to see. So they're very important culturally at that moment, but of course that's also the moment at which the idea of styling is at its uppermost. So it's both a sort of rich and a problematic era, I would suggest. The negative result of the dream car phenomenon was the ideas that styling, superficiality, excessive commercialism and waste had become inexorably linked with it. And I think it took a long time for the car design profession to recover from that association, if it fully has, and that's something we can discuss. Now, from the 1960s onwards, car design, or cars, perhaps more generally, arguably lost a great deal of their cultural significance. This moment went away. And the car became less, I would argue, a symbol of exuberance, optimism, and popular modernity, and increasingly one of anxiety. And that's perhaps where we are now. The car is anxious-making for many reasons. It's a zeitgeist in which I say we're still embedded, however much we seek alternative energy sources and new ways to use cars. Now, I would say we can't blame the car alone for this volte-face, as in many ways there's been a broad cultural turn that embraces everything. The whole sustainability argument is a much broader one than just cars. But again, the car becomes a potent symbol of a more general trend, in this instance a more problematic trend. Now, the 1990s and early 2000s have, however, I think, seen some interesting efforts to demonstrate that car design is not just about styling, but that it can reach deeper into solving problems, and that idea of problem solving is certainly one definition of design, not the only one. And I want to finish off this talk by offering an example of what I would call car design rather than car styling. It's a project that sought, just one project, that sought to make the car more appealing to consumers by addressing the fundamentals of the car itself. And now I'm going to go into a sort of gender-related discussion, because I think this comes in quite importantly here. Since their invention, cars have maintained a very special relationship with the world of men. I think we all know this. Due to the origins of these highly fetishized objects within the male domain of technology and engineering and the male-dominated environment of mass manufacture, the horseless carriage has, over the years, provided an important means through which significant aspects of modern masculine culture have been formed and communicated. As Judy Waxman, who's very much a feminist historian, has explained, this relationship is now deeply embedded within our culture, and she writes, countless novels, films, popular songs and advertisements she has written romanticize flight in a car and link cruising the road with liberation. For men, cars afford a means of escape from domestic responsibilities, I like that, from family commitment into a realm of private fantasy, autonomy and control. That's one side of the story. However, cars, and I don't need to tell you what that side is, you know, cars have had an equally, I would argue, strong association with the concept of style and luxury, earning them a strong presence with what has been described as the highly irrational, female-dominated world of mass consumption. And I think this sits in a very classic gendered binary of production and consumption. Where production is concerned, cars are very masculine. Where consumption is concerned, there's more feminine, and I'm talking stereotypically here, obviously, qualities, and I'll explain what I mean by that. But I think the feminine face of automotive culture has been largely ignored. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about this car. It probably isn't one you know at all. It was an experiment. The YCC Your Concept car, designed by 9 women, and it was launched in Geneva in March 2004. Now, for the very first time, an all-woman designed car offered an opportunity to reconsider the gendered bias of the automobile. The 9-woman team, which made this project happen, set out to rethink not only the gendered meanings of cars, but indeed, through that process, their very being. And this is why it's an interesting project. It's not just about gender. What are cars, they asked? What and who are they for? And how do they or should they fit into our lives? These were the kind of questions they set out with. Addressing these fundamental questions, these 9 women challenged the ways in which we all think about cars now into the future. And in the process, I would suggest, in designing this YCC, as it was called, they were definitely designing rather than styling, and I'll say what I mean by that. Now, a little bit more about women and cars, just before I say more about this. In spite of the overwhelming historical association between men and cars, women have also had a long role within automobile culture, I would suggest. In the early days of motoring, for example, when cars were obviously handmade, few in number, and essentially an expression of wealth and leisure, aristocratic women interacted strongly with cars, relying on them for a trip to the countryside or a visit to the local department store to acquire the latest fashions. And the presence of a chauffeur, you can see that one on the left, there's a chauffeur there, rendered a technological relationship with the automobile largely unnecessary, leaving women to relate to the horseless carriage primarily in terms of its relationship with luxury, lifestyle and leisure. Numerous efforts were made at that time to perfect the development of the electric car, plus ça change, which was aimed at making driving easy, clean and safe, and above all appealing to women. That was one of the arguments for it early on. And Charles Kettering's invention of the automatic self-starter, for instance, was widely referred to as the ladies' aid, providing an indication of the encouragement given to female drivers in the early days of motoring. You see a couple of intrepid women there driving away. Now that encouragement, I suggest, came to an abrupt end with the decision to use petrol and to democratise the automobile through mass production. It was a sort of a short period. And the technological ethos of the factory and the drive towards standardisation pushed the car firmly into the male-dominated world. Now, from the interwar years onwards, however, women have been seen to play a key decision-making role in the purchase of cars, hence on the consumption end, focusing, for the most part, on their aesthetic characteristics, especially colour. And I suppose the hidden thesis I'm putting forward to is that this irrational, feminised consumption aspect of cars was the one that was linked to styling, which might be why we're marginalising it, maybe it's rejected. But I'm not going to go that far, I'm just going to put that out there. Back in 1919, for example, an advertisement in a motoring trade magazine explained that the lady of the house usually has a good deal to say in the choice of a car, and having the gift of eloquence and the time to think up reasons why, lovely thinking, she often wheedles or bullies her poor old husband into buying the car she wants. A decade later, a commentator in 1929 at the New York Automobile Show expressed the view that the feminine demand for line and colour has overborne the mere masculine insistence on practicality, durability, power, and such dull and commonplace things. The cultural polarity created by what social historians have described as the separate spheres of the sexes resulted in men being linked with production and the workplace, and women with consumption, the home, and the creation of social status. That's what historians write a lot about. The responsibility for buying cars was firmly linked to the latter. Another quote by somebody called Sean O'Connell, he says, "Women were adjudged to be attracted largely by styling, colour, and comfort." So that's who Carlyle was aiming at. One way in which manufacturers responded was through regular design and styling changes. Interestingly, he fudges it by calling it design and styling changes at that point. Now, however strongly they were directed at the discerning eyes of women, cars were still universally designed or styled by men. And this is until fairly recently. Carlyle, however, recognised the fact that women played an important role in automobile consumption when in the 1950s he employed a group of women dubbed the damsels of design in his GM styling studio. These are the damsels of design. Now, although in comparison with Volvo's recent dramatic achievement, which I'm going to say a little bit more about in a moment, this was a limited project, but it did anticipate the Swedish achievement in a number of ways. In 1957, he explained that progress was being made. He said, "Besides being colour and fabric specialists, our women designers are tuned especially to the woman driver's problems. They are strong advocates of the six-way seat for greater comfort and visibility. They have designed windshield wiper knobs and other dashboard controls which are easier to see at night. And of course, they are always on the lookout for anything that might snag their nylons. So many talented girls are entering our field of design that in 3 or 4 years, women may be designing car exteriors." So he was looking forward to the day when that would happen. His prediction was overstated, however, and in reality, the damsels limited their attention to colour, creating matching luggage, and adding feminine accessories, such as a cosmetic case into an armrest compartment and tissue dispensers in leather-lined glove compartments. So that's what they actually did. Interestingly, however, they also attempted to address what was already seen stereotypically as women's built-in technophobia and limitations behind the wheel by suggesting that there was a need for what they called automatically guided cars, although no progress was actually made on that front. So a lot of these stereotypes are interesting because they fed into ways of thinking. Now, although they didn't address the whole question of the woman-designed car, GM's damsels were ahead of their time. No subsequent initiatives were taken, though, through the rest of the 20th century to involve women in the design of cars, however, except as the selector of interior fabrics. And in most car manufacturing, if you go into the interior section, you will find some women. And if you go into a design education institution in the textiles department, there'll be a few doing automotive car interiors, but always interiors. As women drivers began to grow in numbers, however, the need to produce a woman's car began to be acknowledged, and small utilitarian cars, such as the Austin Mini, emerged boasting a new unisex character, not a feminine character, but a unisex character. So the idea for a woman's car by the 60s was in place. The Mini's ease of use, its diminutive size, and its neutral styling made it one of the first small cars to appeal to women. Through the last decades of the 20th century, many other manufacturers aimed cars at the female market, often, like Fiat's Pink Panda of the early 90s, self-consciously incorporating aesthetic features which men believed would appeal to women. It's that way around. There were still no female exterior car designers, however. Let's come back to Volvo. In 2002, a group of Volvo women decided to take control of the design of the car as a totality and to redefine it in terms of what their market research told them customers wanted, and in particular, to meet the needs of a growing and important consumer group, women, who this time were paying, not just choosing. Now, from the outset, the YCC was not seen as gender-specific, but rather one which addressed new questions, desires, and needs emanating from women's experience of driving. As a consequence, it offered customers numerous enhanced features, which could be then, the idea was, fed into production cars. It wasn't meant to be produced as a car itself, it was more a sort of means of developing some detailing that could be then used. The team presented, and it was a bottom-up project, it came from women. The team presented their idea to the CEO of Volvo in 2002, and 6 months later they were given permission to proceed, and around $3.3 million with which to create their all-woman designed concept car. And some 14 months later, the YCC was revealed to the public. Not only was the YCC project managed and designed by women, importantly, it also involved women at every stage of its inception and realization. As I said, the idea was a bottom-up one, generated by women at Volvo Cars. Of the 120 Volvo employees involved in its creation, 50% were women. Moreover, nearly 400 female Volvo employees provided input into the project, sort of market research and sort of focus groups. The process which underpinned the design was fairly lengthy in the early stages, as the women involved apparently talked and debated issues rather more than men would have done in a similar situation, or that's what was reported. The aim of the project was to create a car which, as well as being appealing to men, it was not just for women, but for both, was attractive to an independent, professional female driver, possibly single, but without a specified age, named Eve. They called her Eve. To this end, the team focused on a number of themes which had feminine starting points. These included an emphasis on the aesthetic language of the car, both inside and out, its possibility to maneuver it, even if the driver was short, its relationship with the domestic sphere, very importantly, and its focus on practical common sense features. And those were seen as sort of the more feminine end of the spectrum. Now, the aesthetic language chosen for the exterior of the YCC is especially interesting. It's not pink, cute and cuddly, as it might have been if men had designed it with women in mind, but rather sleek and stylish with a high-performance look. The women involved in the design clearly did not feel that they should be excluded from the pleasure that comes from being behind the wheel of a racy-looking fast car. So it was a kind of breaks the stereotype there. The sporty chameleon body shell with alloy wheels, created by Anna Rosen, a graduate of the Art Center in Pasadena who joined Volvo in 2002, contains all the passion and muscly features that one might have expected from her male contemporaries. At the same time, function was crucial, and the importance of visibility for the driver was a key consideration. Rosen has explained that she gave herself the challenge of designing an automobile exterior which prioritised neither practicality nor beauty, but both. She didn't want to hide functionality, but rather to vaunt it, choosing, for example, not to conceal the bumpers by painting them the same colour as the rest of the car. The results of the Volvo's team research showed that while women did not want a bland-looking car, they valued practical features equally highly. The concepts of storage, parking, ergonomics and maintenance topped the list of requirements, and the female engineers and designers involved rose to the challenges. The inclusion of a computerized assistance for parallel parking, the presence of a bumper all round the body offering the opportunity for creative driving, as they call it, and the fact that the YCC has no bonnet. Instead, the car is as near maintenance-free as possible, and a text message is automatically generated to book it in for its annual service. All of these serve to make it a trouble-free car to drive, an advantage of both men and women. The use of rollerball valves for filling the car with petrol and with water for the washer reservoir helped to ensure that there was minimal involvement of the driver in the YCC's maintenance. Easy clean paint, compared to the surface of non-stick frying pans, reduced the need for the ritual of the weekly car wash. Storage emerged as one of the women's key needs, and this was facilitated by the team in a number of ways. The use of gull wing doors, which I'll show you a little bit later, made it easy to take bags in and out of the vehicle, and the cinema-style folding rear seats provided enough space for them. There's you can see one of the gull wing doors and into the interior there. Cindy Charwick, responsible for the interior design of the YCC, devoted a great deal of effort to resolving the female driver's storage needs. By moving the gear shift and the parking brake, storage space was made available between the front two seats. A cool box and a waste paper basket were also positioned within the driver's reach. Other practical responses to women's needs included a headrest which could accommodate a ponytail. The link between the domestic interior, as I've said, historically understood as women's sphere, and the inside of the YCC was imaginably addressed by Maria Ogler, a Volvo employee since 2001 responsible for colour and trim. Along with the emphasis upon practicality, the conceptualization of the interior was among the YCC's most radical features, which you would expect. Soft materials, brushed aluminium and pale laminated wood were used for the surfaces, and instead of the cold functional fabrics conventionally used in cars, the materials used in the YCC brought the feel of the car's interior space close to that of home. You can just about see the pattern on the fabric there. There's a look at some of the storage inside. I'll go back actually to that for now. Like domestic textiles as well, the 8 different seat pads designed for use in the car so you could change it as you wanted to, could be changed, as could the matching carpet. Being able to personalise one's space in the YCC was an important requirement. That every driver should be able to see and reach well was one of the most important requirements for the team. They called the solution ergovision, a combination of ergonomics and vision. The system ensures that all drivers are positioned to their best advantage. On purchasing a YCC, the new owner's body size details are scanned, such that on entering the car, the seat position, the pedals, the steering wheel, the head restraint and the safety belt outlet would adjust themselves automatically. Ergovision had its roots in the fact that most cars are made for the 95 percentile man. The YCC accommodates as well the 5 percentile woman, thereby reinforcing the fact that men were not being excluded, but rather that women were being included. Now, such was the impeccable attention to detail in the design of the YCC and the novelty of the solutions, the result was a wholly radical car, not just because it is designed with women in mind, but because completely new automobile ideas emerged in the process. Not only was this the first time in history that a new car had been designed and developed by women, in addition, a wide range of new automobile concepts had been proposed, which had the potential to move into the arena of production cars and help redefine the car in the process. Now, just to finish, I've spent a lot of time on the YCC case studies because I think it's a good example of car design rather than car styling, although arguably it subsumes the latter and shows it to be just one element within a broader, more generic process. And that's perhaps the important point, that car styling is important, but it's a part of design. Indeed, it shows how car design could provide a model of design practice that attempts not simply to reproduce or even to just challenge cultural norms, but rather to change them. It is arguably a post-Bauhaus model of practice that could be applied to a number of other contexts, showing how car design could actually lead the way rather than follow meekly behind other design fields. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Penny. That was really, really very interesting, and it touched on a lot of the issues that I've been thinking about, and I think that a number of us have been thinking about. I've wondered about the notion of what styling is, and you've helped me sort of think my way through that, because I think it's very important. I think your first comments are really very important. Is how do we engage this whole field in design, in the general design history discourse, and you've shown us how we can do that, and I think that's really very important. Do we have any questions? Yes, quite a few.
Thank you very much for your very engaging presentation, Penny. In relation to Harley Earl and his work in the styling and trim, design, styling and trim, it's interesting that his wife took him to the fashion parades that were going on in New York annually, and she's credited in various biographies of him as being the person that introduced him to this idea of not just the annual changes, but also that the Haute Couture parade is actually a prototyping parade where you can test not just marketing ideas, but technology ideas. And I'd be interested to get your sense that, in a way, there's a kind of continuum where both fashion and, I mean, the other great influence on Harley Earl was Clarence Kelly-Johnson from the Lockheed Skunk Works. So you've got this extreme, and there's a kind of continuum, and just, I mean, this car sits at one point in that extreme, and fins sit at another. I guess it seems to me that car design, in many respects, at various times, has jumped along that spectrum quite profoundly. And if you think there actually is a trend that it's moving in any particular direction, or just continues to jump backwards and forwards, and what you think the influences are that are causing those shifts.
That's really well put, actually. I mean, you're right, the spectrum is fashion, hard technology at the other, or science, if you like. And I think this is why cars are so difficult, because they're complex and they engage all across that spectrum. And what makes it one part of that spectrum more important than another at any particular time is obviously the zeitgeist and the cultural situation in which the car is located and the symbolism it takes on. And I think, as I've tried to suggest, it takes on different symbolism at different points. Where are we going now? I think, well, it's an interesting question. I think we go along in a sort of wave-like movement, and that obviously sustainability and the environment are the key issues at the moment. And so, I think we're trying to scientifically get ourselves out of that problem. And I actually, and this actually relates to the other work I'm doing on plants and interiors, which sounds as if it's a million miles away, but it's exactly the same thing. That my feeling is we're trying to make it scientific when actually it's not. It's cultural and humanistic. You know, we need plants in interiors because we need them. We need nature close to us, not because they give off oxygen, not because they do scientific things. And I think it's the same with the car, that we're trying to get out of it scientifically, and it's actually a cultural and a human issue. I'm not saying I can address that, but I think if we began to think of it on the other end of the spectrum, we might ask some different questions. So that's the best I can answer that question, but it's a good question. Thank you.
Judith.
It needs to have the light off.
Sorry, everybody. It doesn't seem to be a light coming on.
Yeah,
That's
no,
right.
it's off. The light's off, it works.
It's not working, does it?
It just doesn't work generally.
Hi, Penny.
Hi.
It's full on. Thanks for coming all the way to Australia. Probably more a few comments just on what Michael said and this. Harriet and I wrote a paper last year looking at Australian women in the car industry, and I jokingly said at the beginning it'd be a very short paper, but it ended up being incredibly fascinating. But I ended up looking at that case study as well. And one thing that was really interesting about that was that they proposed the automatic parking. And it was the first time somebody had proposed that. And when they took it to the show, they got derided. Oh, women can't park. It's that whole thing. Women
Reinforces stereotypes.
Yeah, and now it's pretty common, and it's seen as a tech innovation, and every car has to have this thing. And I've noticed in the, I read the business sections of the newspapers, and a lot of the tech company stuff gets reported. And there's a real, so what's happening, particularly in America, is that because of Tesla and Apple potentially doing an electric car, is that the car's now being seen as the next tech thing, you know, beyond phones and drones and all of that sort of stuff. And they're basically, they're getting enormous amounts of funding flowing into these tech companies. They're called tech companies now, around all the automation and the software. And they're basically taking the staff and the graduates out of the old traditional companies. So that thing that you went into GM and you stayed there for quite a long time. And that we all thought maybe 10 years ago was the car industry dying and would our graduates get jobs? And it suddenly sort of spiked again. But they're being seen as, so the thing you were talking about, from human to technological then, particularly in America, it's highly technological now.
Absolutely.
And I have some issues around that, and not totally around automation, but just because the tech industry is, again, very driven by masculine culture.
And that's where the money goes, as you say, it's a combination of
It's where the money's going. It's really driven by young blokes who don't get out much, and there's a lack of diversity. And they're saying that they're saying that in Silicon Valley, there's a lack of diversity in the people that work.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting issue. But it's good that the driverless car hits the news. So I mean, at least it's brought the car back as a central problem. But I understand all you're saying. It's an issue.
Oh, I think it's interesting in terms of what Michael was saying. Well, where's the industry going? So that big part of it's going there. One other thing that, because I'm Norm's second supervisor, so we're always having this discussion because his thing is really about the history of Australia and where it comes from. It's starting out these highly technological, engineering-based objects, and then where do they become then that ends up here? And I keep saying to him, where's the point that design comes in? And then we have these discussions, what is design and all of this sort of stuff. But cars really represent that eternal tussle between engineers and designers, because I'm an industrial designer. And in those objects, smaller objects, like furniture and stuff, you as an industrial designer get the opportunity to almost push the engineers a bit aside and say, well, I'm able to do that, and then I'll go and tell somebody how it's made. Whereas in these objects, you need to work with engineers, and it's really come from a very engineering base. So they firmly had their foot in the door, and then the designers came later. So it's just really interesting.
Yeah.
And it's sort of writ large in auto, and it's less so, but there's the area that I work in has nothing to do with cars, but an industry magazine interviewed me the other week, and they said, oh, but isn't design just about making something look good? And I went, do people still think that's what industrial design is today? That it's just, so I started going on about ergonomics and having to interview people about how things are used, and safety and all of these other things. So again, it's that also that perception that people really don't know what industrial design is.
Yeah,
either.
That's right. And just very quickly, the Bauhaus analogy, just to say a bit more about it, because I didn't really explain it. I mean, the Bauhaus thinking comes from craft. Form follows function means that you take a piece of clay and you form it, and the shape comes out of how you made it. That isn't how cars are made. they're made from many different bits. And that's the problem, I think. The more complex an object gets, the harder it is to fit it into that Bauhaus thinking, what possible.
If I can just make a comment on the image you've got there for a start, interesting to note that the design of the Goldwing doors on that almost exactly match the very next model Tesla is having back doors like that.
How interesting.
Yeah, I know the back doors, not the front doors.
Back doors. Oh,
Yeah.
Interesting. For storage purposes, or?
No idea,
No,
I just
no.
saw one about 2 weeks ago.
Oh, interesting.
I'm interested though in your perception of the influence on design in relation to the age of the designer. For instance, if you look at the very first cars that were really horseless carriages, because they would have been designed by people who grew up with horseless carriages, because I've always commented in recent years how all of the modern cars look like they're designed by people who grew up with Lego and Transformers. Is there any relationship, and have you studied it at all?
No, I haven't, but that's fascinating. I think you're absolutely right, that there is a kind of, in all design, there's a kind of lag of the object that came before. And you're right, the horse's carriage is a carriage without a horse, and Model T is what the Model T is, and lots of others. And you're right, once that memory's gone, where does the sort of the origins of the object come from? And it comes from, the making process or the training, your education process, where you've learned what design's about. And that's very interesting. And I suppose now that the story is computer design, isn't it? The shape, the shape looks like, because it's been designed on a computer. So the means of designing and the preconceptions of the designer of what things are affects design, of course. Of course, I think that's interesting.
Hi Penny, thank you. Paul from the National Motor Museum. That was fascinating. I just want to ask for your observations and thoughts on what you brought up earlier was the living room on wheels, and whether you think that the modern car still aspires to this, and any thoughts and observations you have on screen culture in cars imposing into modern cars.
The living room. I think there are vestiges of it. I think we've moved away from it. I think that was the 50s thing. But it's still the place to keep your cup, isn't it? I mean, there are still little vestiges of it, but I think we have moved away from it. I think it's more a kind of a pod. It's something you just sit in, maybe it's a space rock, I don't know what it is anymore, but it's something else. And screen culture, do you mean screen culture affecting the look of cars or screen?
Screen culture inside.
Oh God, yeah.
Yes,
don't know much about that, I'm afraid.
Thinking about everyone's worried about teenagers.
Yeah, what they're going to do on a long journey.
Screens all day, and now we've built screens into the back of the car, so that they
throw them out and get the teenagers to start to do something different.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Do I have thoughts about it? I don't really, but I'd be interested to have a tea-time discussion with you over it.
Okay.
Just a quick comment about the gullwing doors. Fantastic for getting in, but in an accident or in a bad situation, you can't get the doors open. Very difficult also in a car parking situation.
Sure.
And Mercedes found this because all of the SLS Mercedes had explosive charges in the door top, so you could actually get out of the car. So it's a situation of, yes, design-wise fantastic, but in practicality sense, sometimes a big drama.
Interesting. The DeLorean, of course, had it, didn't they, as well? Mm.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And my question is related to this specific project of the YCC. How much is this project in some way representative of a sort of new gender issue coming into the car manufacturing and design? And how much is definitely this the result of education of those people that is quite neutral and just responding to the needs of the new consumers?
I think it's both. I think it's both those things. I mean, I think both are in there. That's why it's so interesting in a way. It's not a sort of a, it's not a women's liberation statement, we've got to have a car for women. It wasn't about that. It kind of arose from, there's a gender story to it, obviously, but these 9 women, they were right across the team. I mean, from marketing right through interior, exterior. They weren't just single expertise in there. They obviously kept together, decided they needed to rethink. And I think you're right. I mean, I think it was about new consumers, of course. And it's Volvo. Volvo is a commercial company, but Volvo is also a very, a company with a lot of thinking goes on. And I think it's both those things.
Thanks, Penny. You made me think more about design separated from styling, but I can just put the two words in one back together again, design and styling, particularly in flipping back to the very earliest vehicles.
Yeah.
And I mentioned yesterday about the horse-drawn vehicles.
Yeah.
I think when you're looking at anything to do with those very earliest vehicles, you've really got to understand the coach builders from the mundane vehicles Absolutely. Through the most extravagant, both interior and exterior. And the influence is so strong, it isn't just this case. And so many people make this mistake of saying, they write an article in a journal, in a magazine or whatever, and they talk about horses' carriages. Say, you plonk an engine in a horse-drawn vehicle, take the shafts on, and away you go. those vehicles had been around for 200 years. There was a whole evolution, and I think automotive historians have to be very careful to pull apart a horse-drawn vehicle. When you've done that, then you have a greater understanding of those earliest vehicles. And the other thing I think is terribly important in the design and styling is the change in materials with time, perhaps the first 20, 25 to 30 years of the 20th century. So when you're saying looking more at interiors, I think that is wonderful. To start looking more critically at car interiors too, I think is such an important area, and that evolutionary style is the correct word I'm using now in this case, and design, I suppose, yeah. So, yeah, great area.
That's very important. I think the coach building aspect goes right up into the Italians in the 50s and in the 60s, they're coach builders. So it's a particular approach towards construction and materiality that's really important. Right.
Hey Penny, thanks very much for that. That was an excellent presentation. I've just got a question about styling on the YCC in particular. If we weren't told that this was designed by a group of women, you wouldn't know that it hasn't been. And a lot of the design innovation that went into this vehicle, it doesn't feel like it's actually translated out into the exterior or interior styling. If you look at other concept vehicles during that time, and also the continuum of design styling within Volvo itself, that it's heavily laden with the design cues of past generations of those vehicles. I was just wondering what your opinion of that is, because I would have thought, given a clean slate, regardless of whether you're male or female, to redesign a car, that you might go and challenge some of these notions and try and reinterpret some of these functional attributes of a vehicle and style them in an entirely different way. I'm just wondering.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think that's the point, really, that this is designed and not styled. What it looks like is what it looks like. I don't think what it looks like is the important thing.
But it's heavily
styling is all about
styled, though. Yeah, but this is heavily styled.
Well, it's styled, but not in a particularly radical way, as you say, because the thinking is design thinking, not styling thinking. And design thinking is, as was said earlier, is not about what it looks like, but what it does. And it's about the details and how it parks, whether it's safe, whether you can store in it, it's all about those things. It's not really about what it looks like. And that's why it's design and not style, I think. You can debate that.
Penny, my name's Paul Berenger. I'm a retired automotive designer, so I have
a
distinct interest in what you're talking about. I'm interested that you moved from the area of bespoke design in the post-war period, where there were wealthy people who could afford to pay $1 million plus or £1 million plus for a car, who actually became the leaders in terms of the market. They influenced the followers. And the followers were able to buy a car for £5,000 or $5,000 based on a design that somebody paid $1 million for. So you have a situation where the manufacturers, of course, are building in large volumes, as you indicated earlier, after the Ford T scenario. And the automotive companies have to understand the broader market as opposed to a specific customer who may have styling interests based on their own personality versus the mass consumer who is looking for a product that will be sold in volume and, frankly, based on market research, are only comfortable with products that they see around them. So the personality issues in terms of a single one-off design versus high-volume cars is very much based on the character of the person buying the car and the comfort zone they have in being a follower and making a good purchase decision based on the number of those products around them. So I guess it's a long way to ask you a question, and that is, how do you see the influence of bespoke design or style, mixing the two words, influencing product design generally, whether it be exterior or interiors?
You mean today?
Today.
Or the future?
Yeah. Well, look, may I categorise that by saying, over the last 50 or 60 years, I believe that's been an influence. And the convergence of technologies that we're now talking about is the next era of design, effectively. The Apples, the Googles and others now who are attracting the talent that would normally have gone from university into an automotive company. And that's very much happened in Japan, whereas the car companies in Japan now are really struggling to get the first tier graduates into car companies because they don't want to go into the car industry anymore. The car is not a fashionable product for them anymore. It's the technology products that have become fashionable.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, two things. Well, one, that's why I kind of made the comparison with haute couture, because haute couture takes exactly the same approach as what you're describing, the sort of the customised object. Today, I don't really know, because I'm not an expert in it, but I mean, the kind of new technological production means we have at our disposal move towards the batch production or the small scale production, and that's certainly happening in product. Rapid prototyping, whatever, you know, sort of, we saw yesterday the 3D printing, all that kind of stuff. I mean, we're post-mass production, aren't we? We're into another era, and it's certainly moving into product design. I don't know how it's affecting car design or how it will affect it, but the logic would be that it might. Don't know. Do you have thoughts? Do you think it will?
Well, yes, I do. I think it's going to have a major impact here. And if we concentrate on the word car design, I prefer to use the word mobility.
Okay.
Because I think the convergence of technologies is
across
also,
objects.
Is also influencing mobility generally.
Yeah, and product design as well. I think probably, in a way, that's what I was trying to do, to put the car back into the general design debate. And I think that's relevant, what you're talking about as well, production techniques. Yeah.
Penny, thanks. My name is Leo Bruno. I'm an ex-car designer as well, now retired. But just a couple of comments on your Volvo.
Okay.
Penny, that thing looks like it was designed by a bloke. There is no question about that.
Well, I think that maybe is the point in a way.
I'm very disappointed in that.
Well, I think it's going back to the same point really, that they were less interested in what it looked like, and at that point I made about, you know, what doesn't matter whether it's matter.
Penny, they were desperate to make it look like it was something out of the cloud. They were desperate to do that, and they didn't do it. Now, the other thing
we can debate that.
Well, no, I can tell you that thing. One of the comments you touched on the car that they declared they wanted to be able to see out of it. Well, the design that they've selected is one of the, you know, with the blind quarter panels on it.
Okay.
You cannot see out of those things.
I'll take your word for it.
Okay? And the other thing too, on all these interior innovations, honestly, Penny, we went through those in the 60s. On the interior.
I'm sure you did.
We did, everything.
You did have flowers
including the hook on the instrument panel to put the pocketbook on, or the purse. You know, it's just, I think that thing's a real waste, and it's a shame on you for using it for a presentation.
Well, I'll defend myself by saying I agree those things were done in the 50s. The dance of design had a go at most of it. But this was a broader, it was an experiment. It was never meant to be produced. It was meant to sort of throw some ideas out into the marketplace, and I think it did that.
No, Penny, it missed the mark a mile.
Okay, fair enough.
It missed the mark a mile.
Believe you.
There were a lot of really clever girls now in the industry, mainly interior, but now beginning, as you said, going into exterior. And some of them are, doing very, very well, making a big contribution. And I'm sure that'll, as time goes by, that'll increase and it'll come out. And they won't make one of these anymore. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Penny, I'd like to stick up for the women after that one. And part of the issue is if you look at this, it's the Volvo grille at the front, the Volvo design period style lights at the back. They haven't started with a clean sheet. And sadly, that's often the problem with most designers. They have to keep the corporate look, be it with the grille, be it with the identification, purely for the market.
Sure.
And that ties your hands before you even start.
Yeah, I see that, yes. That's interesting. Well, it's a Volvo, as you say.
Penny, Andrew, I found that fascinating, and thank you very much. Just to make a comment more than anything else, and the car designers might like to pick up on this. Not continuum, but the relationship between the styling and design aspects. Aerodynamics is surely an area which, at one extreme, in the more latter period of car design, and I use the word advisedly as design, where the function of the vehicle is to operate at speed, aerodynamics and involving streamlining, if you like, captures the use of streamlining in terms of drag coefficients and what have you, necessarily under the banner of design,
sure.
Whereas in Chrysler Airflow days and so on, streamlining, as we've seen, was used as a confected addition to the design of radios and all sorts of consumer products because it made consumer goods more appealing.
Sure.
Locomotives, for example, where the weight of the streamlining is acknowledged as causing as much cost to this potential speed of the locomotive as it may have saved in terms of its aerodynamic benefit.
Yeah.
But having said that, it's an interesting illustration of what you were saying about the fact that styling ultimately becomes part of the process of design if it's used effectively.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, just very quickly on that, I mean, I'm not an expert on aerodynamics, but the impression I get is that historically there have been different views on what's aerodynamic. You know, the teardrop was considered to be aerodynamic for whatever reason, and then the wedge is considered aerodynamic. So visually, there are different. I mean, probably we know what's aerodynamic now. I'm sure we do scientifically, but historically, it's thrown up different visual solutions. Interesting.
Yeah. We have time for one more question. If there is one more.
Thanks, Penny. Wonderful address this morning. I just wanted to ask about the effect of exterior car design studios, particularly in reference to the Italian studios in the post-war era, and more lately developments for more that kind of external design house influence on cars. I understand there are dozens of independent design studios now in the United States working with car companies, and what effect that's likely to have.
That's very interesting. I've not thought about it, but it goes back to, I suppose, this question of new technologies as well, isn't it? New manufacturing technologies. I suppose it's the way of the world, isn't it? Not just in car design, but in product and other things. It's not the big centralised manufacturing in-house thing anymore, but much more outside. I'm afraid I don't know what the implications for design, but we can talk about that.
I think that's, we've come to the end of this session, and once again, thank you very much, Penny, and I'm really glad to see that it fired everyone up. There's always lots and lots of opinions as soon as you say anything about a car. So thank you everyone for participating in that conversation. It was really good. And
oh, sorry, it's one more fabric, sorry.
More fabric. And I was talking to one of our colleagues in the G-Lab here, and he's working on autonomous cars on the interiors because they don't have to look like this anymore. Electric cars don't. And in fact is using the living room as a motif for how will you, when you don't actually have to have an arrangement like that of seating, what could a different arrangement be? And he was certainly going back to the trope of the interior, the domestic interior, to figure out with screen technology, exactly. So it'll be, I mean, you'll never escape the screen, the living room, sofa, and all just take it everywhere around the world anyway. Thank you very much. It was great. And thank you.